My name is Jolene, and I am 31 years old. If there is one truth I have carried throughout my life, it is that family should mean unconditional love. But the reality I lived was far from that. My story begins in heartbreak and ends in a twist so unexpected that even I struggle to believe it happened. When my mother, Sarah, passed away from cancer, I was just 8 years old. My memories of her are fragmented, but the ones that remain are vivid and precious. I remember the way her auburn hair caught the sunlight and how she would brush mine gently before bed, humming softly as though her love could shield me from the world. But no amount of love could protect me from the cold truth. She was gone, and my father, Thomas, wasn't the kind of man to step in and fill that void. While other children clung to their parents after school, I clung to my grandfather, William. He became both my safe place and my guiding hand. He moved me into his big New England home, where the floors creaked under the weight of time and the walls whispered stories from shelves of books. He treated me like I belonged, something my father never truly did. My grandfather was a man of grit and vision. He built Stewart construction from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, with sweat and persistence. Though worth millions, he drove the same car for 15 years and reminded me daily that true wealth isn't what you flaunt, it's what you build inside. Those words became the foundation of who I am. My father, Thomas, couldn't have been more different. He worked at the company but never carried the same respect my grandfather earned. To him, William's empire wasn't about legacy. It was about entitlement. He wanted the fortune, the status, the inheritance. And for as long as I can remember, that hunger shaped everything he did. I grew up watching him ignore me, brush off milestones, and show up only when appearances mattered. While my grandfather encouraged me to dream, my father measured everything in numbers: profit margins, property values, stock portfolios. And though he rarely said it out loud, I could always feel the quiet disdain behind his eyes when he looked at me. The truth of who my father was became undeniable the day my grandfather passed away. At the funeral, surrounded by family, employees, and people whose lives William had touched, my father made a declaration that would haunt me. After inheriting the staggering sum of $56 million, he looked me straight in the eyes and said coldly, "You are useless to me now." What he didn't know, and what I didn't know at that moment, was that my grandfather had left behind something more powerful than fortune, a truth hidden in the fine print of his will, a truth that would turn my father's triumph into his downfall in less than 24 hours. After my mother's death, childhood became a split screen of two realities. On one side stood my father, aloof, distracted, and rarely present. On the other side stood my grandfather, steady, nurturing, and completely devoted to filling the void my mother had left behind. My father's absence was loud. At every school play, I would scan the audience, hoping to see his face. Most times, the seat I saved for him stayed empty. When he did show up, he slipped away the moment the curtain fell, muttering something about an important meeting or urgent paperwork. His life revolved around business, and I was just a footnote he occasionally acknowledged. I learned early not to expect much from him. But my grandfather, William, never let me down. He showed up every single time, front row, camera in hand, his eyes shining with pride. He didn't just attend events, he lived them with me. Whether I was on stage dressed as a tree or giving a speech at a debate competition, he was there to remind me that what I did mattered, because I mattered. Living in his home was like stepping into a world built on both history and love. The house was filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplaces. My bedroom had been my mother's when she was a girl, and my grandfather made sure I felt her presence there. He gave me a canopy bed, told me stories of how Sarah used to sit at the window with her books, and reminded me that strong women had always come from our family. He gave me more than comfort. He gave me lessons that shaped my future. Sunday mornings became our ritual. We made Belgian waffles using his mother's recipe, the kitchen filling with the smell of butter and sugar while he quizzed me on philosophy, politics, and life. "A mind needs exercise, just like a muscle," he would say, asking me questions instead of handing me answers. That was his way, teaching me to think, to analyze, and to form my own opinions. One evening, after I was accepted into college, he handed me a leather-bound journal. Inside the cover, in his neat handwriting, he wrote, "To see the true measure of a person, watch how they treat others when they think no one is looking." I didn't know it at the time, but those words would later serve as a mirror, revealing the stark contrast between the man my grandfather was and the man my father had become. Meanwhile, my father's interactions with me felt transactional. During his rare visits to the house, he would ask shallow questions. "How are your classes?" Or, "Did you get your grades yet?" But his eyes wandered to the antiques, the artwork, the things of value. He wasn't listening to me, he was appraising the furniture. To him, I wasn't his daughter. I was an obligation, a reminder of a woman he had lost, and perhaps even a competitor for an inheritance he already considered his. Still, a part of me kept trying. I thought if I studied business, if I followed in his footsteps, maybe we'd finally connect. When I told him I had been accepted to the same university he once attended, he didn't congratulate me. His only response was, "Business is sensible. It will give you financial security." No warmth, no pride, just cold practicality. It was my grandfather who took me out to dinner, who toasted my achievement, who told me education was never wasted. The older I grew, the more obvious the differences became. William believed wealth was measured in kindness and integrity, while Thomas measured wealth in zeros on a bank statement. William invested in people, giving second chances to workers who had stumbled, supporting charities quietly without asking for recognition. Thomas calculated every interaction for personal gain. Looking back, I realized my childhood wasn't defined by the absence of my mother or my father's neglect. It was defined by the love and presence of my grandfather. He became my rock, my teacher, my cheerleader, and my family. And in that love, he planted seeds of resilience that would one day carry me through the darkest betrayal of my life. As I got older, I started noticing things I hadn't fully seen as a child. My father's visits to my grandfather's house were never about family. They were about business, and more specifically, about what he believed was his future. At first, it was subtle. He would linger in the study, his eyes resting too long on the mahogany desk or the artwork on the walls. He'd casually ask questions like, "How much did you pay for that?" Or, "What do you think the property is worth now?" When I was younger, I thought he was just curious. But as the years passed, I realized it was calculation. He wasn't admiring the things that represented our family's history. He was cataloging them, as if preparing a mental inventory for when they became his. The employees at Stewart Construction knew the truth, too. They adored my grandfather, his grit, his fairness, his genuine respect for the men and women who built alongside him. He had earned their loyalty not through fear or power, but through decency. My father, though, they tolerated him. I overheard one of the foremen once say, "Thomas knows the books, but he doesn't know the people." It struck me because I had felt that same truth my whole life. Even my grandfather saw it. I'll never forget hearing him on the phone one evening, his voice low but firm. "Thomas has the brains but no heart for this business." That sentence stayed with me. It wasn't said in anger, it was said in resignation. My grandfather understood his son, maybe better than anyone. He knew Thomas was clever, but he also knew cleverness without compassion was dangerous. The tension only grew as my grandfather's health began to decline. Suddenly, my father's rare visits became more frequent. He started showing up with expensive bottles of wine, expensive takeout dinners, expensive everything, as if wealth was the language that could buy back years of distance. To outsiders, it might have looked like a dutiful son reconnecting with his father. But I noticed how every conversation circled back to one thing: the company, the estate, the will. "Dad," he would say casually, "maybe it's time we finalize the estate plan. You never know what tomorrow brings." It was chilling. To me, those dinners were about memories and comfort. To my father, they were about securing his position as the heir. His sudden attention wasn't born out of love. It was born out of greed. And my grandfather, wise as he was, noticed too. One evening, after my father left, my grandfather squeezed my hand. His voice was softer than usual, but steady. People show you who they are, Jolene. It's not your job to make excuses for them. It was. The kind of statement that didn't need further explanation. I knew what he meant. I wanted to believe my father was finally trying, but deep down, I knew the truth. He wasn't rediscovering family. He was circling his inheritance like a vulture waiting for its turn. The irony is that my father believed he was playing the long game, positioning himself for control of everything. What he didn't know was that my grandfather saw him clearly and was quietly laying the groundwork for a test that would change the course of our lives forever. When my grandfather turned 78, time began to leave its mark on him. His once strong frame grew frail, his steps slower, his voice softer. Then came the diagnosis: congestive heart failure. The doctors were gentle, but direct. 6 months, maybe less. For me, the news felt like the ground beneath my feet had disappeared. The man who had raised me, the one constant in my life, was slipping away. I didn't hesitate. I packed up my apartment and moved back into my childhood bedroom. My marketing work could be done remotely, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was more important than being by his side. I learned his medication schedule, how to monitor his oxygen levels, and how to recognize the small signals that told me whether he was having a good day or a bad one. Caring for him became my full-time job, and though exhausting, it was also a privilege. During those months, our bond deepened even more. I would sit by his bed and read aloud from Hemingway, Steinbeck, or biographies of leaders he admired. Sometimes he would stop me mid-sentence to tell a story sparked by a line, a memory of his early business days, or a piece of wisdom about people and choices. Life is a collection of stories, Jolene Film, he told me once. Make sure yours is worth telling. On the good days, we would wheel him out to the garden. He had spent decades cultivating his roses, pruning them carefully, tending to them with the same patience he showed me. Everything worthwhile takes time, he said once, pointing to a blooming rose. Remember that with people too. The best ones reveal their beauty slowly. But while I cherished those moments, I couldn't ignore the other presence that began to loom larger in our lives, my father. Suddenly, he was visiting weekly, sometimes even twice a week. He would bring wine too expensive for my grandfather's failing appetite, or luxury meals that William could barely eat. Outwardly, it looked like concern, but I noticed how his conversations always bent back toward business. The Jefferson contract is nearly finalized, he would say, strong profit margins for years ahead. My grandfather would listen politely, but I caught the small glances he threw my way. He knew what I knew, that Thomas's visits weren't about love. They were about positioning himself for what came next. One night, after a particularly forced dinner with my father, my grandfather asked me to help him into his study. His voice was weak, but determined. "Call Harold Jenkins tomorrow," he said. Harold was more than his attorney. He had been a trusted friend for over 40 years. The next day, Harold arrived with his briefcase. He and my grandfather spent 3 hours behind closed doors while I waited outside, torn between curiosity and respect for their privacy. When Harold finally emerged, he patted my shoulder gently and said, "Your grandfather is a wise man, Jolene. Always has been." He didn't elaborate, but I could see a certain calm in my grandfather that night, as if he had made important decisions and found peace with them. That same evening, as I adjusted his pillows, he took my hand. "Promise me something," he whispered. "Promise you'll live by your own values, not anyone else's expectations." "I promise," I said, though my voice trembled. "And one more thing," he added, his eyes sharper than they had been in weeks. "Don't worry about your future. I've made sure you'll be taken care of." At the time, I thought he meant emotionally, that his lessons and love would carry me forward. I couldn't have imagined the literal weight of those words. His decline was faster than any of us expected. Within weeks, he was bedridden. I barely left his side, sleeping on a cot in his room, holding his hand through long nights. My father began showing up daily now, his concerns seemingly real. But I had learned to recognize his patterns. Even as my grandfather's breathing grew labored, Thomas would still bring up contracts, profits, and estate matters. In his final hours, William pulled me close. His voice was faint, but his words etched themselves into my soul. Remember who you are, Jolene. Blood doesn't always make family. The truth has a way of revealing itself. He passed peacefully at 3:17 a.m. I was still holding his hand, telling him about the sunrise he wouldn't see, when I realized his chest had stopped rising. A silence filled the room, one so heavy it felt eternal. I had lost my anchor. But what I didn't know then was that my grandfather had left behind something more powerful than I could have imagined, a test that would unravel my father's greed and change my life forever. The morning of my grandfather's funeral felt as heavy as my heart. The sky was gray, the air damp with the kind of stillness that presses on your chest. Stewart Construction had shut down for the day, and the parking lot of the funeral home overflowed with cars. William Stewart had touched countless lives. Employees he had given second chances to, clients he had worked with for decades, and friends who admired his honesty and grit. Inside the church, the atmosphere was solemn yet warm, a reflection of the man we had come to honor. I sat in the front row, hands clenched around a box of tissues. My grief, a physical weight pressing against my ribs. My father sat beside me, perfectly polished in his tailored suit, his assistant behind him taking notes about who attended and which business connections were present. Even in grief, he was thinking of optics. When it came time for eulogies, my father spoke first. His words were polished, professional, almost sterile. He praised my grandfather's business acumen, his financial stewardship, his leadership. But there was nothing personal, nothing about the man behind the empire. It felt like a speech designed for shareholders, not mourners. Then it was my turn. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the podium, but once I looked out at the sea of faces, the words poured from me. I spoke of Sunday mornings making waffles, of quiet conversations in the garden, of the lessons he taught me that shaped my soul. My grandfather measured wealth not in dollars, but in moments, I said, my voice trembling but clear. His true legacy is love, not money. When I returned to my seat, the tears finally came. After the service, people crowded around with condolences and memories. Among them was Harold Jenkins, my grandfather's attorney. His silver hair and solemn eyes gave him a presence that immediately steadied me. He clasped my hand and said, "There will be a reading of the will tomorrow at 2 p.m. Please be punctual." My father, overhearing, jumped in eagerly. "I've cleared my schedule completely. Will the company transfer papers be ready as well?" Harold's expression was neutral, almost cool. "All relevant documents will be presented," he said curtly. That night, the reception was held at my grandfather's home. The house was transformed by caterers into a space that was both elegant and subdued. People mingled, shared stories, and offered comfort. But while I floated through the room, numb with grief, my father was busy huddling in corners with business associates, dropping phrases like restructuring opportunity and leadership transition. It felt like he was holding strategy meetings during his own father's wake. By the end of the evening, the house had emptied, leaving only my father and me. I was gathering empty glasses when his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You should pack your things tonight." I froze. "What do you mean?" "After the will reading tomorrow, I'll be moving in. This house has always been meant for the company's CEO. You've been here as my guest, Jolene, but it's time for you to find your own place." His tone was cold, businesslike, as if he were announcing a corporate merger rather than uprooting his daughter from her home. I felt the breath catch in my throat. But this has been my home since I was 8. My entire life is here. He looked at me with no trace of sympathy. "The property belongs to the estate, which will transfer to me as heir. You'll need to remove your belongings tomorrow." That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, the room that had once been filled with my mother's presence and my grandfather's care. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow on the wall, felt like a reminder that I was losing not just my grandfather, but the home that carried his love. I cried until my eyes swelled, torn between grief and shock at my father's cruelty. I had known he was ambitious, even greedy, but I never thought he would strip me of everything so quickly, so ruthlessly. The next day, at precisely 2 o'clock, the will would be read, and though I didn't yet know it, the man who had just thrown me out of my own home had already sealed his own downfall. The morning after the funeral, I moved through the house like a ghost. Every corner carried memories. My growth marks on the wall by the staircase, the banister I used to slide down despite my grandfather's warnings, the reading nook where we'd shared countless hours with books. Each one whispered, "This was home, and now it isn't." My father had made sure of that. By the time I came downstairs, 2 uniformed security guards were already in the foyer speaking with him. A locksmith was changing the locks at the front door. When he saw me, his expression was cold and businesslike. "These gentlemen will escort you out when you're ready," he said. "You hired security to remove me." My voice cracked, disbelief clinging to every syllable. "A standard precaution during ownership transitions. Nothing personal," he replied smoothly, as though uprooting me from the only safe haven I had ever known was just a routine transaction. It was personal, though, every bit of it. The guards were polite, even apologetic, as they carried my suitcases to my small Honda. "I'm sorry, miss," one whispered when my father's back was turned. I could only nod. My throat was too tight for words. As the car pulled out of the driveway, I took one last look at the house. Sunlight caught the chandelier inside the entrance, scattering rainbow patterns across the floor. The same rainbows my grandfather used to point out to me as a child. My father stood in the doorway, keys in hand, already claiming victory. I drove aimlessly at first, tears blurring the road until I pulled into the parking lot of the Lakeside Inn. It wasn't much, just a modest hotel with weekly rates, but it was all I could afford on short notice. My marketing business had suffered during the months I devoted to caregiving, and my savings were thin. The room was clean but impersonal, beige walls and generic artwork that made me feel even mon, displaced. I placed my grandmother's knitted afghan on the bed, the only piece of home I could carry with me. That night, I sat by the window, staring at the parking lot lights, and broke down completely. The grief came in waves. First for my grandfather, whose steady presence had been my anchor, then for the house, the rooms where every memory of love was stored, and finally, for my father. Not for who he was, but for who he would never be. Even in the darkest moment of my life, he had chosen money over me. The hours crawled by, but sleep never came. My mind raced with questions. Where would I live long term? How would I rebuild my business? Could I ever truly recover from being told I was useless by my own father? By morning, I forced myself into motion. I called Angela, my closest friend from college, and asked if I could stay with her for a few days. She didn't hesitate. "Of course," she said. "Come tonight." But even that comfort didn't erase the pit in my stomach. When I opened my laptop to search for apartments, I nearly laughed at the absurdity. The rent prices were impossible with my reduced income. For the first time, I wondered if my father had been right, that without my grandfather, I was useless, adrift, unwanted. It was the lowest point of my life. And it was only then, in the pit of despair, that fate began to turn. A phone call from my grandfather's lawyer was about to change everything. It was just past noon when my phone rang in that dreary hotel room. The number flashing on the screen was unfamiliar, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. My nerves were raw, and I didn't think I could handle another cold voice delivering bad news. But something in me whispered, "Answer it." "Miss Stewart?" a formal voice asked. "This is Patricia from Harold Jenkins' law office. Mr. Jenkins would like to see you this afternoon regarding your grandfather's estate. It's urgent." My pulse quickened. Urgent? My father had already inherited everything, $56 million, the house, the company. What could possibly be left for me? Maybe a small bequest, I thought. A piece of jewelry, perhaps. Or maybe this was simply about paperwork. Still, I agreed, and by 3 o'clock I was sitting in Harold's oak-paneled office, the air thick with the scent of leather-bound law books. The elderly lawyer rose to greet me, his expression gentler than it had been at the will reading. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Jolene," he said, motioning for me to sit. "I expect you've had a difficult 24 hours. Those simple words nearly broke me. Tears welled in my eyes as I admitted, "Thomas had me escorted out this morning. Security guards. He changed the locks already." Harold's brows rose sharply. "Did he indeed? That is very interesting timing." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He reached for a thick blue-bound folder and opened it with deliberate care. "Tell me, Jolene, did your father actually read the will in full yesterday?" "He skimmed it," I said slowly. "Then he told you to send a summary. He said he caught the important parts." Harold chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Ah, yes, that is Thomas to the core. Impatient, arrogant, always assuming he already knows everything. Well, your grandfather knew him just as well as I do, and he crafted this will very carefully with that in mind." My heart thudded in my chest. "What are you saying?" He adjusted his glasses, flipped to a marked page, and began to read aloud. "The bequest to my son, Thomas William Stewart, is contingent upon his agreement to provide lifetime support for my granddaughter, Jolene Sarah Stewart. This includes, but is not limited to, housing at the family residence, a monthly allowance of $10,000 for living expenses, and coverage of all educate, tenal, and health care costs she may incur. Should Thomas fail to fulfill these obligations, or should he act in a manner that causes significant distress or hardship to Jolene, the entirety of the estate, including Stewart Construction and all associated holdings, shall immediately transfer to Jolene Sarah Stewart." I gasped. The words spun in my mind like a whirlwind. But he already threw me out yesterday morning." Harold leaned back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Precisely. In less than 24 hours, Thomas violated the most important condition of his inheritance, which means, my dear, that you are now the sole legal owner of Stewart Construction, the house, and all associated assets, worth approximately $56 million. I covered my mouth with my hand, my body trembling with shock. That can't be right. There must be some mistake. "No mistake," Harold said firmly. "William knew his son better than anyone. He even predicted Thomas would fail within a week, likely within a day. And he was correct. This is one of the most ironclad conditional wills I've ever drafted." My chest tightened, this time with relief and gratitude. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't forgotten me. He had trusted me enough to outmaneuver his own son. I whispered, "Why didn't he just leave everything to me directly?" Harold's eyes softened, because William believed in giving Thomas one last chance to be the man he should have been, a father, a protector, a steward of legacy, but he also wanted to protect you, and so he designed a test Thomas has already failed. As the truth sank in, a mix of emotions swept through me. Vindication, grief, shock, and above all, the overwhelming knowledge that my grandfather had been right about everything. The house I had been thrown out of that morning was now mine. The company my father had spent his life circling was now mine. My grandfather's fortune, his legacy, his trust, it was all mine. And my father? He had outsmarted himself. By the time I left Harold's office, the world outside looked different. The same streets I had driven down in despair that morning now seemed charged with possibility. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He had protected me, believed in me, and ensured I wouldn't be left adrift. But along with that revelation came a new weight, facing my father. Harold advised me to contact the estate's security company immediately. "You may want to have them meet you at the house," he said, sliding a card across his desk. "It is your property now. You'll want to change the locks back." The irony nearly made me laugh through my tears. Less than 24 hours after my father had me escorted out, it would be me standing in that doorway with authority. I called the company, and they agreed to meet me at 5 p.m. When I pulled into the circular driveway that evening, my stomach tightened. My father's black Mercedes was still parked by the front door. For a moment, I considered turning back, but then I remembered my grandfather's words. The truth has a way of revealing itself. I straightened my shoulders. This was my home now, not his. The security team arrived right on time, 3 uniformed officers with a van full of tools. I explained the situation, showing them the legal paperwork Harold had given me. The lead officer nodded respectfully. "We'll need to inform the current occupant of the change in ownership," he said. Thomas himself answered the door. When he saw me standing there with the officers, his face shifted from annoyance to shock, and then to barely contained fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked. The officer stepped forward. "Sir, we've been authorized to update the security system at the request of the legal property owner, Miss Jolene Stewart." "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "I'm the owner as of yesterday. Everything was transferred to me." I met his eyes, my voice calm but steady. "There's been a development with the will. You might want to contact Harold Jenkins. You violated the conditions less than a day after the reading." His face drained of color. "What condition? What are you talking about?" I gestured toward the study. "Perhaps we should continue this inside." Reluctantly, he stepped back and let us enter. The officers began their work, changing locks and updating codes, while Thomas and I faced each other in the study that had once been my grandfather's sanctuary. "Explain yourself," he demanded, pacing like a caged animal. "Grandfather's will required you to provide for me," I said evenly. "Housing at the estate, financial support, and no actions that caused me distress. By throwing me out, you broke that condition immediately, which means everything transfers to me." He stared at me, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "That's impossible. Harold would have told me." "He did. You just didn't bother to read the full document," I replied. For a long moment, he was silent, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. Then he tried a different angle. "This is some kind of trick. You and that old lawyer cooked this up. There's no way." "Grandfather planned this months ago," I said. "He knew you better than anyone. He gave you one last chance, and you failed it within a single day." The knock on the study door broke the tension. The security officer stepped inside. "Miss Stewart, the exterior locks have been changed. Where would you like the new keys delivered?" I turned to him. "I'll take them now, thank you." As he placed the keys in my hand, I looked back at my father. For the first time in my life, I saw him stripped of his arrogance. He looked lost. "This is my house," he said, but his voice wavered. "Not anymore," I replied quietly. He took a step forward, his face desperate. "You can't do this to me." I shook my head. "I didn't do this. You did." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and for once, my father had no reply. The next morning, I arrived at Harold's office 15 minutes early. Even though I now held the keys to the house and the company, my stomach was knotted with anxiety. Years of seeking my father's approval had conditioned me to shrink in his presence, and the thought of facing him again unsettled me. Harold greeted me kindly, his words both comforting and grounding. "You look just like your mother. She had the same quiet strength." At exactly 10 a.m., the door opened and in walked my father. He was no longer rattled like he had been the night before. Instead, he wore his usual mask of composure, accompanied by his attorney. He spoke with rehearsed confidence. "This misunderstanding can be resolved. I'm prepared to let Jolene stay in the guest house while we sort out a proper arrangement." Harold cut in, firm but calm. "There is no misunderstanding. The terms of the will were clear and you violated them within a day. But before we discuss anything further, William requested you both view something together." He dimmed the lights, turned on the projector, and there on the screen appeared my grandfather. My throat tightened at the sight of him, frailer than I remembered, but with the same piercing clarity in his eyes. "Thomas," he began, addressing my father directly, "if you are watching this, then you have done exactly what I predicted. You showed Jolene the door as soon as you believed you had secured your inheritance." My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. "I have watched you chase wealth your entire life," my grandfather continued. "No matter how much you gained, it was never enough. The company was not enough. The house was not enough. I gave you one final test, one chance to prove that family meant more to you than fortune. All you had to do was care for your daughter. Instead, you discarded her. And so, as was made clear in my will, everything now passes to Jolene. This is not a punishment, Thomas. It is the natural consequence of your choices." The room was silent when the video ended. My father's face was flushed, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear, but he waved him off. For once, he seemed shaken beyond words. Then Harold started the second video. My grandfather appeared again, but this time his expression was warm, his eyes soft as he addressed me. "My dearest Jolene Amma," he said, and tears immediately spilled down my cheeks. "If you are watching this, then everything has happened as I expected. I am sorry for the pain your father has caused you, but I am not surprised by it. You have shown me what true family means, not in words, but in the way you cared for me in my final months. That love is worth more than any fortune." He leaned closer to the camera, holding up a framed photo of my mother and me when I was 5. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. Stewart Construction is now yours. Don't be intimidated. You have something your father never had, an understanding of people. Lead with compassion, Jolene. That will be your strength." The screen faded to black, and I sat motionless, tears rolling freely. My grandfather's voice had pierced through my grief, filling me with both sorrow and strength. My father broke the silence, his tone sharp and defensive. "This cannot be legal." "It is entirely legal," Harold replied evenly, "and it was entirely foreseeable." For the first time, my father seemed to realize that he had truly lost, not just the money, not just the company, but the final word from his own father. In the days that followed, the weight of my new reality began to settle in. I wasn't just the unexpected heir to a fortune. I was the owner of Stewart Construction, a company my grandfather had built from scratch with his bare hands and relentless will. At first, the responsibility felt crushing. I had studied business and marketing, but running a multi-million-dollar construction empire was something else entirely. Harold reassured me that my grandfather had thought of everything. He had left behind detailed instructions, a transition plan, and even recommendations for mentors within the executive team. "William trusted you more than anyone, Jolene," Harold reminded me, and he prepared for this moment carefully. So I stepped into the role, not with swagger, but with quiet determination. My first week was a blur of meetings, stacks of financial statements, and crash courses on current projects. The executives were cautious at first, unsure if the granddaughter could handle the weight of leadership. I could sense the doubt in their eyes, though most were too polite to say it aloud. But I also sensed something else, curiosity. They wanted to see what kind of leader I would be. I leaned into what I knew. My background in marketing became an unexpected asset. Where my father had always spoken in numbers, I spoke in people. I met with employees on job sites, listened to their stories, and asked for their input. I sat with clients, not just to talk about contracts, but about their visions, their frustrations, and their trust in our company. Slowly, I began to earn respect, not because I had inherited the title, but because I was willing to listen and learn. At the same time, my father began circling again, only now his tone was different. A week after the confrontation at the house, he arrived unannounced with a bottle of expensive wine. "I thought we might talk," he said, his voice coated with a forced humility. "Father to daughter." I invited him in, but I didn't uncork the wine. He perched on the edge of the sofa, trying to look vulnerable. "I've been reflecting," he said. "Perhaps I've been too focused on business. Perhaps I haven't been the father you needed." For a moment, I almost believed him, but then the conversation shifted, as it always did, toward the company, the Jeff. "First and contract alone requires delicate handling," he said, his mask of concern slipping. That was the moment I realized his remorse wasn't genuine. It was strategy. I didn't shut the door on him completely, though. My grandfather's final letter had left a path for reconciliation, and I wanted to honor that. "If you truly want a relationship," I told him, "let's start with dinners, just us, no business talk." His smile faltered, but he agreed. I could see the frustration behind his eyes, though he tried to hide it. Over the next several weeks, he tried different approaches. Sometimes he came with old family photos, trying to stir my emotions. Other times, he appeared with business contacts, hoping to slip back into operations. Each time, I drew boundaries. I left the door open for genuine connection, but shut it firmly on manipulation. Meanwhile, the company began to thrive under a new direction. I launched the William Stewart Foundation, a nonprofit arm dedicated to providing trade education for underprivileged youth. It was something my grandfather would have loved, creating opportunities for hard-working young people to learn skills and build futures. The announcement brought positive press, new partnerships, and more importantly, pride in knowing I was honoring his values. At the foundation's launch event, my father appeared uninvited, positioning himself near me for photographs as if he had been part of the effort. I didn't correct the assumption in front of reporters. I focused on the mission instead. Later that night, over a drink, he studied me with a look I hadn't seen before. "You really believe this, don't you?" he asked. "That business can be about more than profit." "I do," I answered simply. And so did grandfather. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't pitch. He just nodded slowly, finished his drink, and walked away in silence. And for the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of something in him that looked almost like recognition. 2 years after my grandfather's passing, I found myself standing quietly at his grave. The headstone was simple, just as he would have wanted: his name, the years of his life, and the words he chose himself. "True wealth is measured in lives touched, not dollars earned." I knelt and placed fresh roses at the base of the stone, my fingers trembling slightly as I whispered, "You were right about so many things. About the company, about Dad, about me." So much had changed in those 2 years. Stewart Construction was thriving, not just in profit, but in spirit. We had expanded into sustainable building practices, taken on community development projects, and through the William Stewart Foundation, dozens of young people now had access to trade education and careers they never thought possible. Every success felt like a continuation of my grandfather's vision, proof that his values lived on. My father was still part of my story, though in a very different way. He no longer held control, and his attempts to manipulate had lost their power. I had even established a modest trust fund for him against Harold's advice, because I wanted him cared for without giving him leverage. To my surprise, he accepted it quietly, almost with dignity. Slowly, cautiously, we had built something resembling a relationship, not close, not perfect, but real in its own way. It wasn't reconciliation in the storybook sense, but it was a fragile thread of progress, and that was enough. As for me, I had grown into someone I barely recognized compared to the woman who once sobbed in a beige hotel room believing she was useless. The uncertainty that once paralyzed me had been replaced by quiet confidence. My grandfather's lessons had taken root, and I realized his true gift wasn't the $56 million fortune or the company. It was the courage to trust myself, to lead with compassion, and to never confuse kindness with weakness. Forgiveness had played its part too, not the naive kind that forgets everything, but the kind that frees you to move forward without carrying the weight of bitterness. My father's betrayal no longer defined me. My grandfather's love did. Standing at his grave, the autumn wind brushing through the trees, I felt gratitude more than grief. Gratitude for the lessons, the love, and even the trials that had forged me into who I was now. I looked at his name one last time before turning to leave. The inheritance you left me wasn't money, grandfather, I whispered. It was knowing what truly matters, and I'll never forget that. As I drove back to the home that was now truly mine, I thought about the twists of fate that had brought me here. In just 24 hours, I had gone from being homeless to owning a $56 million company. But the real transformation had taken much longer, and it ran much deeper. Because in the end, the greatest inheritance of all wasn't wealth or property. It was the lesson that love, respect, and integrity outlast every fortune, and that sometimes being underestimated is the very thing that reveals your strength. So I leave you with this. Have you ever been underestimated only to prove someone wrong? Or maybe you've had a family member who taught you what really matters, not with their words, but with their actions. Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this journey touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you for listening to mine.